So this lecture is going to cover the American Revolution, topic 3.5 in your book. With your reading and with this lecture, you should be able to do what these objectives state. We're going to focus mostly on the Enlightenment in this lecture and its connections to the American Revolution and the new American government that came out of the Enlightenment. There's going to be a video that you'll be able to watch that explains the battles a little bit more if you're interested in that. So here's our vocab. I won't go over it, but I'm going to tell you the Stamp Act is going to be super important, and to know popular sovereignty, federal republic, and checks and balances is really going to help you not only in this class, but in the future. So some people, King George III, obviously the King of England, is going to be kind of our main antagonist to the whole story. George Washington, Ben Franklin on the American side. James Madison, a few of you may not know who he is. He's going to be the founder of our modern style of American government. He pretty much wrote the Constitution. And Thomas Jefferson. So, background. Britain wins the French and Indian War, which is going to be a major cause of the American Revolution. So before the French and Indian War, you see that the British controlled colonies here and up here in Canada. And the French controlled pretty much the center of the continent, with the Spanish down here on the south. So the French and Indian War has sometimes been referred to as the First World War. It stretched all the way from Europe into the Atlantic Ocean, all the way over to North America, and then it went to India and all the way into the Pacific Ocean. And it was between the French and the British, but in North America, where we're going to focus on, it was between the French and their Native American allies, and the British and the British colonists. So no surprise, the British end up winning, and the British take Canada and what we know as the Midwest and the South from the French. The French then get Louisiana from Spain. And the king's goal after winning this, King George's goal, is to reassert his control over the American colonies. They had pretty much been doing their own thing for a while. He wants to show that he is the king and he is in charge. So the first thing he does is this. It's called the Proclamation of 1763. And he pretty much draws a line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, and he says, no more settlement from British colonists west of this line. But the British colonists feel that they won this land in that war, and they should be able to have it and get it. So they disagree with the king's ruling. So post-French and Indian War, Britain is in a ton of debt. And what they have to do is they have to pay, remember I talked about the Proclamation of 1763, they have to pay for all the troops that are going to be stationed along this line here. There's going to be 10,000 soldiers. So what they do is they start taxing the colonies. And they do this through the Stamp Act of 1765. There's several other taxes and acts, but we're going to focus on this one. So what the Stamp Act does is it slaps this giant tax on the colonies on all paper products. And if you know anything about back then, paper was everything. Entertainment was books, newspapers, and board games and cards, all made out of paper. You literally had to go get a stamp that looked like this on all that to show you paid the tax. If you got letters or you wanted to buy paper for letters or documents, legal documents, you had to pay the tax. You can see how this can add up very quickly for both individuals, but especially businesses. And that makes the colonies more and more mad at the British. The British are also going to use a policy called mercantilism to try and make money off the colonies. With a colony, it is never for the benefit of the colony. The mother country, the country that rules over the colony, is the one who gets all the benefit. So in our example, our mother country is going to be Britain, which is the UK. UK and Britain, they're the same thing. We're going to call them that interchangeably throughout the year. Our colonies are obviously the 13 colonies, the American colonies. So in mercantilism, the colonies send raw materials to the mother country. This can be anything like lumber, cotton, gold, silver, iron. So they send those raw materials up to the mother country, and the mother country taxes them, but then also turns them into finished goods. So things like scissors, guns, knives, kettles, ships, shirts, jewelry, and then they ship them back to the colonies, and the colonies buy them. So in this cycle, the mother country makes all the money. They get the materials they need, and they're able to extract money from the colonies. If you look at this cartoon over here, you can see the colonies kind of like presenting raw materials to the mother country. The mother country takes what it needs from the colonies for it to survive. How the British make sure that this happens is the Navigation Acts. So what they do is they make a law that all trade from the 13 colonies has to travel on ships from Britain. Those ships are naturally going to stop in Britain. They're going to get taxed. They're going to unload their goods. Britain makes it into finished goods and sells it back to the 13 colonies. Britain makes all the money. And then they just start the cycle all over again when the ship gets back to the colonies. If you want more information on mercantilism, this video is going to be a really good resource. It'll be on our Google Classroom when I upload the notes. You can just click on it and watch it, and it'll explain mercantilism a little more. So another major reason the revolution starts is the colonists felt they had a right to kind of rule themselves a little bit, this idea of self-rule. So the colonists had governed themselves from day to day because remember, Britain is thousands of miles away. There's not a lot of contact between the two. So they had their own legislatures, and all a legislature is a Congress. All it does is it makes laws for a place. So they had their own Congresses. They were making their own laws, and suddenly the king comes in and says, you got to follow all my laws now. This is going to make the colonies more and more mad because they feel like they now have no control over their actual own government and their own laws. The Enlightenment ideas also had a major impact. It wasn't like people sat around and said like popular sovereignty and natural rights and used it, but the ideas were there. So popular sovereignty is that idea that power comes from the people. Those taxes and those acts that the British government were putting on the colonies didn't have a vote in the British government. They didn't have a representative over in Britain voting for them. So they felt like they had no say. So they said, well, where's our say? We're not telling the king that he can put these taxes on us. There's also the idea of natural rights, that remember, you have those rights that come from birth. And they're saying that the king is breaking their natural rights by, there was one act called the Quartering Act where British soldiers were actually put in your home because they needed room and board. There was an act where they closed Boston Harbor and they made it so people couldn't trade. The king started appointing his own judges to act as the jury and judge for criminal trials. So they said our natural rights have been taken away, and that gives us a right to rebel. This is all about that idea that we learned in 3.4, the relationship between natural rights and the social contract. If the king breaks the social contract, the people, the colonists, have the right to rebel against the king. So the war starts. Obviously, like I told you, I'm not going to go over all the battles just because we don't have time. But the colonists eventually make the Declaration of Independence. And it is hugely influenced by John Locke. And all the Declaration of Independence is them telling the king, you broke the social contract, so we have a right to leave. So the colonists include grievances, which are just complaints against the king. And this is their reasons. They're saying that the king broke the social contract. Obviously, this isn't all of them. There's 27 in all, but a couple of them are taxing without consent, no taxation without representation. They're saying you're putting taxes on us without our permission. We have a right to now leave your government. You broke the social contract. Dissolving their legislatures, getting rid of their congresses where they make their own laws. Again, they're saying the king is making laws without our consent. He broke the social contract. We're allowed to leave. And taking away their right to a trial by jury. The king is just having a judge say guilty, ship him off to prison or execute him. He's breaking our natural rights, so the colonists have a right to leave the king's government and form their own government. This video here, this goes over the actual war, especially from till about 6 minutes, talks about some of the battles. This is also just a great review video of the American Revolution. The crash courses are all great. They're pretty much aligned to everything that we're learning. So the war happens. It's a long war. It's extremely brutal. And eventually the United States pulls off the victory with help from France, Spain, and some other European powers. And the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. And in the Treaty of Paris, Britain is forced to recognize the United States of America. They're forced to say, you won the war, you're an actual country now. The U.S. also gets all the territory to the Mississippi River. So we can see this is right before the war really starts, the Declaration of Independence. After, the United States goes from just this little area here to all of this. So the United States did very well and pretty much kicked the British out of what would be the modern United States, and the British only hold Canada. So the Americans now have to come together and actually form a government, and it's going to be highly influenced by the Enlightenment. So America's first government is called the Articles of Confederation. You'll learn a ton about this in U.S. history, but it's a total failure. It's not strong. It doesn't have a good central government. There's not even a president, so it just doesn't work. America's second government, though, when they see that the Articles of Confederation isn't working, is called the Constitution. The Founding Fathers come back together in 1789. They create a new government that we still use today. The Constitution is hugely influenced by the Enlightenment. It uses pretty much all the ideas of the Enlightenment. But the big ones we're going to hit on are first, separation of powers, and this is from Montesquieu. So the United States government to this day has three branches of government. We have the executive, which is the president, the legislative, which is Congress, and the judicial, which is the Supreme Court. And they're separate, so none of them can get too much power and become a dictator. We'll go over how they do that when we get to checks and balances. There's the Federal Republic. This is going to be called federalism. Now, this is kind of a hard concept, and when you get to government, you're going to learn all about this. There's a whole unit on it. But federalism is the exact opposite of what they had under the king. Under the king, he controlled everything. What the king said went. In federalism, the government is broken up a little bit. There's the national government, which is the U.S. government, the United States government. We'll also call it the federal government. And there's the state governments like Ohio. And in federalism, they split things up. There's different powers that each of them has. So in federalism, the national government is the only one that can print money. There's no Ohio currency. In federalism also, Ohio controls its schools. There's no like U.S. schools. But then both of them share the responsibility of making roads. There's checks and balances, and this goes with the separation of powers. So in checks and balances, each of these branches can stop the other branch from doing something. So if the legislative branch wants to make a law and the president doesn't like it, he can veto it. That law doesn't pass. If the judicial branch is making rulings that the Congress doesn't like, they can change the Constitution so that now the judicial branch can't do that anymore. And if the president tries to do something that the judicial branch thinks is unconstitutional and goes against the Constitution, they can declare it unconstitutional and the president can't do it. There's a lot more checks and balances than that, but it just kind of shows that all these branches can stop each other from doing something so none of them get too much power. And finally, we have the Bill of Rights from John Locke's ideas of natural rights. And all the Bill of Rights is, it's the first 10 amendments in the Constitution, and it lays out the rights that the government cannot take away from its citizens. Some of those are trial by jury, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms. The government cannot take those rights away because they're natural rights. Remember, they're given from God and birth, and no one can take them away. So you can see that the Enlightenment highly influenced the U.S. Constitution. So I hope that kind of clears up some of the connections between the Enlightenment and the American Revolution and the new American government that was formed. And if you have any questions, just let me know.